With Half of a Yellow Sun, which won the Orange Prize for fiction, you sort of just ruled the world literally. And I can understand why it would be difficult to start writing again. But also I wanted to ask you just to begin a story about a story as difficult as the Biafran War. How can you sort of pick up the courage to go into that field and make a story which is not just about war, but perhaps most about human beings?
You know, the real answer is I don't know. I think this is the sort of, only in retrospect, looking back, because when I was thinking about writing the book and when I started writing Half of a Yellow Sun, I really didn't think consciously about, you know, this is something I need courage to do, how do I do it? Instead, it was more, there was a lot that was intuitive, there was a lot that was, I was writing about I was really writing this book for my grandfathers who had died in the war. I was writing it for my family, for myself. So it was this, almost the sense of an obligation in a sense. I felt driven, I felt that I went mad for 4 years of my life. And
an obsession of a sort.
Yes, it really was an obsession. And the final year, I really went mad. I just didn't do anything else but write that book. And you know, and it was, and I think most writing is sort of this process where one day you think that you know what you're doing, and then the next you're just completely demoralized, and you think it's complete rubbish, and you've wasted 3 years. And with Half of a Yellow Sun, it was worse because I would sometimes stop and think about about the stories behind the story that I was writing. So I would read a section, for example, and think to myself, this actually did happen to people who were related to me, and so it comes with a sense of obligation, and I just felt that I had to. Right? So I didn't think about courage. I just thought I have to write this book. I feel that I just have to, which is an entirely different process from what from now that I'm supposed to be writing a novel. It's really different because the subject is different, and I don't have that kind of. I'm not as possessed by some sort of force.
War demon, Biafran history, yes. War demon. Yes. But did you do something? Did you study? I mean, was it half writing fiction and half studying what actually happened? Because I understand that this is not a thing you learn about in school in Nigeria. It's not a subject in school. It's sort of something you have, and it's not even something you talk about in the families.
Yeah.
It's like a gap of a lack of knowledge commonly.
Yeah. Which I think actually happens in, I was just talking to somebody a few days ago who's Dutch, and I'm very interested in how, I'm sort of deviating from your question.
That's okay, I can pick it up.
I'm very interested in war memory and how people remember or choose not to remember war, and interested in the Second World War and how the countries in Europe choose to remember or not remember. And how the Dutch, he was telling me, and even the second generation have these, and I'll be interested to know what it's like in Denmark, but sort of these internalized ideas and the way that they remember the German occupation of the Netherlands and the hunger and all of that, and how it has somehow gone on to the next generation who feel this strong sense of antipathy towards Germans, but they don't actually verbalize it, right? So it's there, and it's not talked about. In Nigeria, when I was growing up, I knew that something had happened in our recent history, and people would mention it, but never in a way that had any substance. And I had the sense as a child that this was something that you were not supposed to talk about. So my parents would say something like, many of the family stories would end with, and then the war came. But it ended there. Or my mother would say, oh, I used to have that, but then the war came. And nobody said anything else. And when I was 12, I was reading about it because I was interested, and I don't know why. It's very difficult to, I can't intellectualize why I was, but I was haunted by that period in our history. And I was the child who would read books and then ask my father questions, and my parents are very patient people, so God bless them. So,
they have more than one child, so they have to be patient.
No, they don't. They have 6 children.
Yeah, I know.
And so yeah, so I was sort of, I think I was preparing myself in a way to be ready to write Half of a Yellow Sun. And it took a long time, and it took also processes of writing other things about Biafra. So I wrote, I wrote a stupid little play, and I wrote short stories. And
a stupid little play?
Yes.
About the Biafran War, or about...
Yes. Yes.
In what way was it
I was
stupid?
16, it just was. And I really hope that nobody, I mean, the reason I have to talk about this is that for me, it's a way of sort of making a case for how I have been haunted by this period for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
This period meaning sort of the Nigeria-Biafra War period, 1967 to 1970. And I say that, and I have to talk about the play, but then I'm thinking I hope nobody will go looking for it, because in Nigeria a few weeks ago, a woman said to me, "I read your play," and I thought,
God.
No, you did not, you did not. And then of course I start to tell her I was 16 when I wrote it, you understand that, right? But, so I'd done all of these things to sort of, and then I decided I wanted to read everything that had been published about, everything I could find. Because I knew that writing this book would not just be a novel. I knew that because my generation know that Biafra happened but don't really know what happened, I knew that for them it would be history, not just a novel. I knew that people would read that book and see it as history, and I didn't want to get the facts wrong. And so I did so much reading, and then I talked to people. So I had the facts from the books, but I wanted to know how people experience them. And my father really was just really fantastic. He was so patient, and he answered my questions, and I talked to his friends, and I talked to my relatives, and I talked to everybody really. I mean, I was a bit of a nuisance for about a year when I was doing the research process. And I have all these notes that I didn't even use for the novel, so I think I might write another book on used notes from Biafra. Just so that I don't waste all that labor.
You have 2 sisters in Half of a Yellow Sun who are different characters and, and different ways. Why women? Why all these strong women?
Because I know women like them.
You knew women like them?
Yeah, I know. I think for me that it's interesting to me that sometimes in literature, when there's a strong man, it's normal, right? But often when it's a strong woman, it seems almost remarkable. And to me, my life is a life full of strong women. A strong woman isn't something that I find remarkable, it's something I find normal. But I think in some ways what I wanted to do is that the fiction that I had read about Biafra, and in some ways just war fiction in general, often overlooks women and their contributions. And in reading about the war, I just was struck by how women, because the war changed the roles, and so the men had gone out to fight, and suddenly women were doing jobs that they hadn't really been allowed to in some sense. I was just struck by it, and I felt that I wanted to write that. I wanted to write those stories. I was interested in them, and I wanted to write about how women ran refugee camps, huge refugee camps, and women ran them. How women, went across enemy lines to trade because they had to keep their families alive, and that sort of thing. So yeah, I just felt that it was a story that hadn't really been told in fiction, particularly.
But it's true, there are many strong women in your literature, and there's also a lot of sex.
Is there? I don't think that's a question.
That's not a question. Well, I think it's a question in the sense that you can read a book like Half of a Yellow Sun, which is full of very painful things with the war, and then there's such a lot of joyful sex. And I find that very wonderful. It's a sensuous thing that you have. You have a sensuous way of writing.
Thank you, that makes me happy. But I have to tell you that not everybody agrees with you, because in Nigeria, some time ago, a man sort of stopped me, and this happens all the time, by the way. People sort of just stop me in the streets and give me little lectures about my books. So he stops me and he says to me, you wrote a very important book about our history, and I said, thank you. And he said, but why do you have all that sex? And I said, well, because people have sex. And he said, no. And he said, he said to me,
he said no?
And then he said that the problem with it is now we can't use it in schools, because he said, we really need our kids to know what happened, and what you've done is you've denied them the right to, and I said, when you say kids, do you mean, sort of primary school? And he said, yes. And I said, but it's interesting to me that people who have that sort of, what seems to me to sort of be a prudish mentality about sex, don't have it about violence. I said, I don't want 11-year-olds reading about beheadings. Right? So, I mean, why would you be comfortable having them read about what happened in Biafra and not want them to have this? Anyway, so I really disagreed with him, and we had a wonderfully heated conversation. Then we parted with friends.
Oh, that's good. I think that's a very common thing, that sex somehow is worse than violence, and I don't know. It's strange. It's also violence and violence against women and violent sex is also part of the war history, isn't it?
Very much, yes. And I found it really, I remember a woman who actually had never talked about her experience until she was my uncle's wife's friend, and she had been raped, and she had never talked about it until I started to, ask them questions, and then she got emotional, really emotional, and for me, it was just very moving. So in some ways, actually, I have a scene in Half of the Yellow Sun where there's a rape. And of course, there were many rapes by soldiers from the other side, which happens in all wars because, they're just sort of, often women's bodies are used in that way. But the idea that, Biafran soldiers raped Biafran women, for me, was just very, there's just something about it that was particularly sad.
Yeah. It's a horrible thing. I think it happens in all wars, actually. In your first novel, Purple Hibiscus, which came out in 2003, and you had been writing for a long time, but this was it. There's a girl who is strong in a very quiet way. The main character, Kambili, is very oppressed by her father, who is a Catholic and an important man. I was very moved by this book. I read Half of a Yellow Sun first, and then Purple Hibiscus came out here in Denmark, and I found it. This is a coming-of-age history of this girl, and I thought, well, war is one thing, but oppression within a family can be equally strong. Are they two sides of the same coin? Actually, these books somehow.
So just listening to you talk, I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm very dark, and I mean, there's now that I'm probably thinking
we just talked about sex,
so it's not all,
okay.
we should probably talk more about sex, but when Purple Hibiscus, I don't know. I'm interested. I think in general it's hard. Again, for me, the people who I know, fiction writers, good fiction writers who start off with themes. I don't know how to. So I start off with sort of just a vague sense of what I'm interested in and character, and at the end it becomes something. And so Purple Hibiscus was me. I wanted very much to write about religion, because I, just as actually I wanted to write in particular somebody based on a character based on somebody I knew. A friend had a father who was in some ways like the father in Purple Hibiscus, and when my friend told me about his father, my friend said to me, "You know what our fathers are like?" And I said, "What do you mean? What's your father like?" And when he told me, I thought, no, my father isn't like that at all. But it then, in some ways, inspired, I suppose. Inspired is such a strange word, but it gave birth to Purple Hibiscus in a way. And having grown up Catholic, but in a family that was very moderate, but still, and growing up in a country like Nigeria that's incredibly religious, a very religious country in just the most profound ways. The religion you cannot run for public office in Nigeria if you're not a believer in God. if you're not a public believer in God, if you don't sort of talk the talk, right? And
is that going to church, talking the talk? Or?
Yeah, you have to, when you do your campaign speeches, you have to mention God.
Okay.
If people ask you why we have bad roads, you have to say we will pray.
Maybe we should, this is election time in Denmark, maybe we should try that one.
And if you don't say those things, nobody will vote for you, because it's just a very strong religious, it's religious Christian in the south, religious Muslim in the north. It's just very religious. And it just interests me to see how this manifests itself. There's a sense in which I think, and obviously I think it's clear that I have a problem with it. You know, I think religion as a whole is actually a very good thing. I think religion can be a force for good, and I've seen people who have been transformed in just the most beautiful ways by religion. But then on the other hand, for me, growing up, I also saw how people could become very rigid, just extremely sort of rigid in their thinking because of religion. And then you wonder what happened to your good sense? You know, did it just disappear when you found faith? And I find that interesting. So I wanted to write about this man who, you know, isn't a monster. He's human, because he you know.
He's a human monster, I would say. Really.
Okay, well, I suppose that would, yeah, a human monster would work, yes, yes. But you know, I think what I mean is that just to say that somebody, I think it's too easy to say that people are monsters, and I find that we do that increasingly. We're just like, oh, he's a monster, and then we close that. And I think, well, no, because people who do many things in the name of religion also do the basic human, they show kindness in other ways, they love and are loved, and it kind of makes me...
Yeah, but we are talking about a man who is religious in the most, I don't know what word to use. It's a law. It's not like a feeling. It's like he beats up his daughter.
And he does that because he thinks he's doing the right thing.
And he beats up his wife. So to me, this is a man who, he's also a political figure in the community, and he does
fights for human rights.
He fights for human rights while he beats up his wife. He's very strange and not very charming.
You don't like him very much.
I was affected by this story very much, but still she finds, and actually, I mean, I'm not obsessed with sex, but it's through the relationship to a man that to actually a priest, that this young woman...
but there's no sex.
There's absolutely no sex. There's a lot of repressed feelings, but no sex. But I mean, you do use this the strong feelings of love and sex as a relief, as a humanized thing in a dehumanized context, don't you?
I think I'm also really just sort of, I try to pretend that I'm cynical and sarcastic, but deep down I'm just a hopeless romantic. I really am. And I'm also just really a believer in love. I think that, and different forms of love, not just romantic love, but, you know, the fact that love really can, I just believe in love. I believe that love can heal, right? I mean, it sounds very mushy, but it's true. And in Purple Hibiscus, I think that for her, so she's young, right, and very impressionable, and has had just the most awful life. And when this young, vibrant priest who's different, who's human, who looks at her as a human being, who listens, and most of all, who thinks, right? That for me, it's fantastic, the idea that you can have faith and also think. Yeah. Right? Because sometimes it seems that both are mutually exclusive. And so she meets him, and in some ways, that priest is my ideal. He's actually kind of based on a priest that I knew when I was growing up, who's still a very close friend of mine, who is the one reason I still have respect for the Catholic Church. That priest.
One single man.
Yes.
Though you are against the single story. I've heard you say that.
That single man represents many stories. He represents the possibility.
That was a clever answer. There's another thing which is important, I think, in your literature, and that's skin. There is so much skin in your... there's a lot of, what color of skin you have, if it's dark brown or light brown. Almost all the persons you describe go through somehow the skin.
I need to keep that in mind for this book.
To avoid it or to keep up the good work?
No, but I think that that's interesting. But I think actually that when you're, for black people, skin gradations matter a lot more. I mean, I think that maybe if you're white, you can sort of be pale or tan. But if you're black,
you can be reddish in the most boring way. But I think that sort of yeah, that's interesting that you say that. But yeah, I do think that so there's light and the different kinds of light. There's sort of, so in my family, for example, and also I think maybe because complexion isn't just complexion. Complexion also carries its own baggage. Right? The idea, for example, that in Nigeria and I think in most of Africa, the lighter skin means somehow you're more attractive automatically because your skin is lighter. And darker skin, you know, that exists very much. So I think that maybe, and in Half of the Yellow Sun, I think that I wanted to play around with that a bit. So the woman who is dark-skinned and not considered beautiful in the African sense because she's very thin and doesn't have sort of curves, I made her very interesting and intriguing and, you know, sort of more appealing in my mind than the woman who's more conventionally beautiful. But yeah, skin tone, right? But also but I think for me it's also we're just trying to get the reader to know what they look like, right? Yeah. Because to say, and I find this interesting in the US, for example, where when people talk about race, they will say a black man, right? And you can't, for me, I can't visualize it. Does he look like Barack Obama, or does he look like Don Cheadle? Right? It's a vast range, and it's really different things, I think. And in my family, there's such a range. My mother is very light-skinned. My father is very dark. I have a brother who is almost as light as you are, and I have a sister who's really dark, who's almost sort of Sudanese-looking. So we have that range, and I think for me particularly, because I write realistic fiction, and you just try to, you know, show people how they are. So I suppose that's why I have that. But you know, it's interesting. I don't even know that I do. But I just thought that it would be a sort of hierarchic thing, that there are differences, and that it does mean something that we are not necessarily aware of.
Not always. I mean, the idea of sort of lighter skin being considered better, it also in some ways is tied to class. So the lower you go, the more that kind of thing is widely held. Right? The more educated you are, the less likely that will happen. But yeah, it does. I mean, a woman who works at a magazine in Lagos, one of the sort of women's magazines, was telling me recently that that they had an editorial meeting and they had done an interview with an actress, a Nigerian actress, who was very beautiful and dark-skinned. But they had decided not to describe, and so you know how the magazine starts, sitting sprawled on the chaise lounge, the dark skin, and then they took out the dark skin because they said she would be offended to be described as dark skin.
It must be difficult to be offended by your own skin.
And she actually is dark skin. Yeah. So I thought that was quite funny, and I wrote it down in my notebook, and I thought I probably will use this at some point in my fiction.
Do you feel anger is a way to write things? Or offense, perhaps, even?
I'm not sure how to take that. Yes, I am angry. I don't know if anger, I think maybe passion. It's something I feel very strongly about. But I have to say that story, that's the one story in the book that really came from rage. I was furious when I wrote the first draft. You should have seen the first draft.
What did you leave out? We want the short parts.
But sometimes, and this is also interesting, just what fiction demands of you, because it's something that I've increasingly been thinking about, and you know, where fiction starts, and because fiction is such an intrigue. On the one hand, when you're writing realistic fiction, it's based on real life. But on the other, fiction demands certain things of you. Fiction demands that you, at least sort of realistic fiction, demands that you make your characters round, but actually in real life many characters are flat. But fiction demands roundness. It is true.
Roundness meaning that you have to understand them more than you feel like,
or that you have to make them that they can't be cartoon. They can't be just sort of that they can't, that they have to be human, as we like to say. But we know people who are not human,
I know.
right? And they don't work in fiction. So sometimes you translate something exactly as it happened. It doesn't work in fiction. It just doesn't. And I find that a lot of times the things that people most so if I wrote a short story, for example, and I sent it out to my readers, I have a few friends who are my readers. Usually the parts that they have most concerns about are the parts that I haven't changed at all, that actually did happen, and I find that interesting, and I actually think that at some point I might write about what fiction demands of you and how it can be, how it can get thorny. But this story, yes. But I humanized him a bit, the male character.
You humanized him a bit.
But in a way...
Great. I think that was very kind of you, because he's not a very nice person.
He's not a nice person, but at the same time, afterwards, I felt a bit bad about the story, particularly because it got so much attention when the book came out, because, I started to feel that I didn't want this to be this is a man I dislike, obviously, but but he's not a writer, so he can't write back, and I kind of felt...
You can only shout back at you.
Well, I sort of felt that I had... it's kind of like I would like to draw a gun when somebody else can't draw their own gun, I felt a bit bad about it, because also, for me, it was really about the idea of who has the right to tell you what your story is, rather than just about this man, because this man represents something larger. It's not just him. There are many people like that. And also about power, that's the way the world works. I think that the entire global structure is just totally messed up, but that's a story for another day. And the way that, if you're a young writer from a country that is poor, a country that doesn't have resources, a country that doesn't have the kind of funding for the arts and that sort of thing, you're going to be looking to another place. And so you have these young people from different African countries who are invited by a foundation in England that can afford it, and they all are eager to be published, and so they go, and and then you have somebody in this position of authority saying to them, no, don't write a love story in Africa, write about war and starvation and AIDS. Yeah. And they do, because that's the way that, so it sort of feeds into its own process. That's what they write because somebody's told them that's what you should write, that's the African story, and they write it, and that becomes the one story, and that becomes, and I remember going to that, the workshop on which this was based, and just really feeling the strong sense of, I was pushing back. I just thought, no, you can't. I'd written a story about women in Lagos, and I was told that it was agenda writing.
Meaning what?
Meaning that I was sort of pushing maybe something called the women's agenda. I wasn't sure what this was. Apparently this is what I was doing, but I just remember sitting there and just being enraged and thinking, because again, this was a story that I had literally lifted from my friend's life in Lagos. And I was being told it was agenda writing. And instead I was being told, oh, you should write about Abacha's terrible government. And I thought, I don't care about Abacha's terrible government. I want to write about women in Lagos. So that story came from and also just watching other people there and understanding why they would follow this rule, because they want to write, and just being so angry about how the power that was just so obvious in that room, and it made me so angry, and I went back to my cabin, which was called Baboon Lodge, and I wrote that story.
Not the Uncle Tom. Did anybody have?
And also it was sort of, for me, even more, there's so many things that were offensive about that workshop. It was just, I felt misogyny. There was sort of misogyny, and there was nasty racial undertones, and I just found it really horrible. But I think I've made my case. It's true.
I think when you talk about the problems of being a writer in Nigeria who wants to publish, or in any perhaps poor African country, you published in America.
Yeah, but I actually published first in Nigeria. That play that I mentioned.
Oh, now you take back the play. Thank you so much.
Thank you.